timestamps in the chat, and I'd probably also require that the panelists don't either, because we can focus on judging the round. So I would just prioritize that you time yourselves and others for POIs, but I will cut you off at 7:15 and unmute myself. So you should stop talking, but you should know that by now. Second of all, please indicate your POI preferences before you start your speech. Chat by default, don't interrupt speakers unless we give you the permission to do so. And finally, please take POIs. It's important for engagement and has affected calls in the debates that I've chaired at this tournament. So please make sure you do that. Are there any questions before we start? To open this partial Octo-Final, I call the Prime Minister to start the debate.
I'm audible, right?
You are.
All right, starting in a second. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Two broad pieces of constructive in OG. Firstly, we're going to talk about how this creates more tight social networks and how it makes fans more engaged and fulfilled within the process. And secondly, we're going to talk about how we are basically crowding out immoral actors, such as immoral countries and like corporations that have pervasive incentives to influence those organizations. But before that, let's frame this debate. Firstly, we think like there are a lot of adjustable models that can be used. For example, the fans being global fans, or secondly, they could be representatives from across the globe. We think each team can cater best to its own organizations and to decide the structure it wants to. Secondly, we think that owners notice like they determine the general direction in which the team is going. That is to say, for day-to-day activities, most likely we're going to have managers. For specific knowledge that is required in terms of administration and financing, we can consult with experts. And finally, we think it is reasonable to assume that fans are like most likely educated people, and some of the fans that will be elected will be people who have expertise themselves. We think this is a pretty reasonable model. So we think like owners decide democratically and by the rule of the majority what is the general direction the team will be going. The general direction is, for example, how the team will portray itself or which priorities and strategies it is going to have. For example, is it going to be rebuilding itself, or is it going to maximize to like its like strength to win the next competition, or like in advertisements in the way in which it presents itself to social media? Is it going to focus on the past and being like glorious again, or like crafting a whole new version for themselves? And finally, like there's two private investors, like they still just don't have the majority in it. So I think this is in the debate. Now, first point, second point of like characterization, what are the interests of those fans? And I think this is very important in the debate. First, we think that fans have an inherent interest for the teams to, that is to say, for them to achieve glory. But secondly, regardless of whether or not those teams win, we think the fans have an inherent incentive for the games to be competitive, fair, and enjoyable. That is to say, regardless of who wins, for the games to actually be something that is worth watching. We think that secondly, fans have a much more vested interest in tight communities. Why is that the case? Because often enough, fans are the people who are watching those matches, either because they have played personally, it's part of their identity, or it's something, an activity that connects them with other family members or with friends, and it's a considerable amount, and it has been a considerable amount of like how much labor and how much money they have spent in order to craft this identity. So it is very important for them. And thirdly, I want to talk about pride. Those people often enough at the point at which it's a central part of their identity, we have to notice that it like they associate the image and the pride of the club with their own image and pride. That is to say, at the point at which most people are like moral actors and they wish to be ethical and fair in the way they treat others and to behold certain values and standards, we think this is much better on the comparative. But what is the comparative? We think the comparative is not having fans that care about values, ethnicities, but having owners that wish to maximize their profits. Why do they wish to maximize their profits? Because firstly, they're competing with other people for investments, and this is perceived to them as an investment. But secondly, compared to fans, they have like made the investment to buy the club, which means they want to make a profit out of it. So their incentives are necessarily catered to maximizing profits, and also there is a gap between the knowledge that they have of like this certain team and like the knowledge that the specific knowledge that the fans would have at the point in which they have been following it for much longer. Now, first point of constructive, why do fans feel happy? I think the first reason is pretty intuitive. At the point in which this is run by fans, some decisions, like the majority of them, are going to cater to their needs. That is to say, if a person within the team is struggling and like it's not having his best streak, what like an owner would do who wishes to maximize profits is to kick him out and replace him with a person who is optimally performing better. But at the point at which there is a beloved player who defends love, we're going to retain it and give him a second chance. I think that secondly, they feel more included at the point at which they can actually see the representatives have similar lifestyles and similar experience to them. That is to say, they're fellow fans compared to like businessmen who may not even have any personal experience with football, and it's just another investment for them. But in that, thirdly, this is about feeling a sense of ownership. That is to say, at the point at which it's a central part of your identity, the subjective feeling of you feeling as though this is something that you have control over, and this institution kind of represents your needs, I think is hugely important. I think that this is important, firstly, because it crafts a sense of identity. And I think this is hugely important because a sense of identity is what many people strive towards. That is to say, it gives them a sense of purposefulness and fulfillment. But secondly, it is something that gives them social networks. That is to say, people you can rely upon, and which is hugely important to the point at which we're social creatures, and we are not only like need people when we're financially struggling, but also when we have personal problems, when we want to like have fun with others. And we think that thirdly, and uniquely to sport, this is extremely beneficial at the point in which it transpasses other personal differences. That is to say, like gender, ethnicity, or like age groups are transpassed at the point at which the identity is crafted specifically by the love that you have for this specific activity. So I think this is a really bounding activity that not only makes you feel good because of the competitiveness of the play and because it gives you a sense of identity, but because of the social networks that it manages to build. So I think this is comparatively better on our side. But before I continue and talk about immoral actors, I'll take a point from closing.
Yeah, you talk about the way that this aids people forming communities as they support clubs. But like Joan Laporta, when he went for re-election in Barcelona, lost by like 49% to 51%. How does this amount divide down the middle of football clubs with massive high-stakes elections lead to community and unity?
I think comparatively it is better, even if there is competition within who is going to be elected, at the point at which those people who eventually end up elected are closer comparatively to you in terms of lifestyle and your association with them compared to like businessmen. So I think comparatively it's better on our side. Finally, I want to talk about immoral actors. And this is basically like, firstly, immoral actors like countries and corporations cannot buy their way into a club by the sheer virtue of them putting money into it. Or secondly, they cannot those clubs are not going to make problematic advertisement deals or other business deals in which they have to associate themselves with certain corporations. And we think this is hugely problematic. We think this is hugely likely to happen at the point at which fans are personally engaged. That is to say, it is a part of their identity, it's a part of their pride, and they don't wish to stain the image of the club, that is to say their own image, with like immoral actors that wish to maximize their profits because they run on completely different value systems. And we think this is hugely beneficial at the point in which those companies have to be kept accountable. That is to say, at the point in which those corporations, for example, commit atrocities in the developing world, or like we have problematic authoritarian countries like Saudi Arabia that wish to like fix their image. This is the point in which we actually manage to keep them accountable and inform the public of their actions, so in turn they can make informed decisions about it. Because on the comparative, what happens is that those companies are starting to legitimize themselves by being associated with that. And the first search that you make in social media or in media in general is their association with football clubs, which is something hugely harmful because it harms discourse and actively harms the crimes that they have committed. So in summary, we think we're better capable of keeping immoral actors accountable, and we're better capable of maximizing, regardless of winning or not, the enjoyment of fans and the capacity for them to build meaningful identities and to form tight social connections. So I think for all those reasons, I'm just very proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for their fine speech, and I call upon the Leader of the Opposition to start the case for side opposition.
Hi, am I audible?
You are audible, yes.
Thank you. So my pronouns are she, they, and if you want to ask me a POI, please put it in the chat. If I don't take one by 5 minutes, 15 seconds, please just feel free to unmute and ask. With that said, I'm going to start in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. OG's benefits are literally just not exclusive. The point in time that identity and ownership can be accessed through literal social networks when you go to the pub and watch Liverpool play, or when you decide that you want to like play football fantasy manager or whatever that's called, you can access friendships and social networks and people to rely on. I am just unsure as to why ownership is the critical requirement to be able to access this. I would actually posit that people actually want to interact and make friends when they are happy. And in the vast majority of circumstances, happiness only comes when you win and are successful. That is to say, when England loses, for instance, and you have riots on the street and people literally beating each other up, that is not when you are ready to make friends. I'm going to tell you two things: why we make sure that football clubs do well in the long run, and two, why we think fans do well in the long run. There's going to be two things that I talk about in this speech. One, I'm going to talk to you about the model and the counterfactual, and then I'm going to talk about the fundamental problem with this model of ownership, talking about specifically how this reduces the inflow of external capital into clubs and why fans are just not good actors. The first thing that I'm going to do with regards to the counterfactual is just say that I just do not think that we need to make sure that literally every club has majority fan ownership when we can input regulations on irresponsible actors. I think that even if you have, for instance, this being weaponized as a tool of soft power, we will say that we can just ban straight up sovereign nations from owning clubs. I think that we can also do things like requiring donations from owners to local communities or charities that fans think are important. I think that these are all regulations that you can put in place. I think that if the problem is overspending, you can do things like FIFA financial fair play and enforce this through penalties even more so. I think that all of the problems that OG points out can be dealt with by these things. You can impose restrictions. I think that similarly, in the vast majority of cases, these foreign owners are not necessarily bad, evil people. I think that at the end of the day, their best interest often coincides with the club's best interest. I think that there are a couple of reasons for this. I think that the first, if these really are the bad sort of evil actors and are only really getting involved because they want cash money, I think that what you can do is effectively make it so that, they can only turn over these clubs and get profit if the club is successful. That is to say, no one wants to buy a losing club or no one wants to invest in a losing club. I think that similarly, if they're doing it because of personal ego or soft power, they also need success, because you can only get a cake of being like, I don't know, some evil megamind mastermind if you are doing well. I think that similarly, there is an incentive to make sure that fans actually like you or are generally okay with you the point in time that you need a successful fan base for the club to succeed. This is why Mike Ashley of Newcastle cannot sell the club, because fans are just so disconnected from the club in and of itself. I think at the end of the day, we are able to show how this is going to look like in our world, but also what the counterfactual is. What then is the fundamental problem with this model of ownership? And here I'm going to talk to you about how this reduces the inflow of external capital into clubs. I think that the important thing to note is the point in time that you say that owners can only access about 40%, that is literally the only amount of capital that they will put in. That is to say, 40% of a stake means 40% investment. Because look, foreign investors want autonomy and ownership in this capacity. I think that the reason why this is important is because the success of the club is what leads to pride. No one wants to be part of like a losing club or losing narrative. And I think that the reason why this is important is because success and success literally becomes arbitrary. I think it becomes a geographic lottery. That is to say, the fans that are likely to be investing or becoming these stakeholders within these clubs are more or less likely to be from these areas, given that support is often geographically tied. I think that the point in time that you have areas that are literally dirt poor, like Manchester, like Newcastle, within the north of the UK, and the fans come from these communities, they are just simply going to be unable to fund stadiums, purchase players, or have clubs compete financially. I think that the impact of this argument is that the club literally languishes. And I think that the reason why this becomes even more important is because often enough, this sense of identity and this sense of pride in the club is what keeps communities going, even when they do not have access to other things. That is to say, Liverpool, which is an incredibly politically disenfranchised region. But one of the reasons why they're able to sort of be happy and have success is because their club is what means so much to them. I'm now going to tell you why fans are bad actors. I think I have 4 mechanisms for this. I think that the first is to say that they are just short-term biased. That is to say, they want success and they want success now. They're going to do things as a result that make it so that you get success in the short term, but not necessarily in the long run. They're also averse to pain. That is to say, they do not want to lose. They don't want to feel sad when they are losing. And therefore, they're going to want to minimize this to the greatest extent. I think that the third reason that they want immediate success is because it is tied to pride. That is to say, their ego and their personal want to see victory is going to drive them to make short-term decisions that aren't necessarily going to be beneficial in the long run. I also think that fundamentally, fans will just have different opinions. That is to say, you will have incredibly decentralized and splintered decision-making. because you want different players all the time. I think that this is just bad in terms of decision making because you are never able to get anything done. I think that the impact of this argument is that you will sign the best players even if they are incredibly expensive and the club goes under. So even if you can't afford, like, I don't know, Kylian Mbappe, you're still going to pay for him because you really fucking want him. I think that the second thing is that you are likely to fire executives and coaches prematurely because you want to see success from them now. And if they do not deliver, they're out. I think that the reason why this is so important is also because of the moral imperative. Because these fans are so incredibly invested in a world with ownership, they're going to feel an extreme moral burden to pour all of their savings into these clubs. I think that at the end of the day, this means that at the expense of their own personal future, they're willing to throw away everything if they are able to put in just a little bit more money into their clubs. I think that this is specifically important for those geographically poor regions that I talked to you earlier about, where football clubs are incredibly important for identity, are incredibly important for community, right? Because they're going to literally take their pension savings and throw them into the club. I think that it is criminal to levy this burden on them because this is going to effectively bankrupt these individuals. I think that if your concern is about ticket prices or season tickets being too expensive, this harm is literally amplified in their world. I think that we still have regulations to make sure that we curb the worst excesses of foreign ownership. I think that at the end of the day, we're able to show why football clubs just get better in terms of long-term centralized making, but fans also have a better life the point in time that they are taken care of. Very proud to oppose.
I thank the leader of the opposition for her fine speech. Just a reminder that you're highly encouraged to take POIs. I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to conclude the case for side opening government.
So none of you are going to understand what I am about to do, but that is okay. This round is being streamed, so they'll call me a hero back home. Serca červeni, serca milioni, za šampioni, samo CSKA. This, if you don't know, famous Bulgarian team, doesn't matter. It's on the stream, whatever. 3 things that we're going to do in this debate. Firstly, we're going to do some kind of general rebuttals about some things that don't fit in clash that OO gave. Secondly, what we're going to explain is why owners have necessarily very bad incentives and why OO seem to run a backstabbing case in which they say, oh, fans want to succeed, but owners also want to succeed, but it's bad when fans want it, but it's good when owners want it, which I don't get that. But secondly, we're going to explain why fans have good incentives, but finally, we're going to explain why identity is necessarily far better, and often there are problems of identity in the status quo. But firstly, what we want to rebut is this point about, oh, but they can just access all of our benefits on the counterfactual through other ways. 2 responses to this. Firstly, this is not a wood motion. They don't get counterprop fiat. They cannot say that this will happen. They need to explain why this is likely to happen, and it's not, right? But the second thing is, even if they do get some of these sorts of regulations, which is the biggest burden, let's say they do get them, know that they're likely to be temporary. At a point where the profit incentive always exists, these regulations will always be scaled back because there will always be big actors that lobby you to do this. On our side of the house, the profit incentive doesn't exist because the fans don't gain money from their ownership in this sort of thing. They don't put up the initial money to do this, meaning that very problematic things are likely to exist on either side, and they must engage with why this is bad, because this is very bad. Companies use this shit to rehabilitate their image. Plus, as a victim of these companies, it's terrible to see one of the most famous people on the planet shilling for a company that killed your fucking grandparents, right? This is big impact that happens at a point where this is allowed to happen. But the second thing is they say, oh, but this will lead to a decrease of external capital, which is bad. 2 things about this. First, note that this is a comparative decrease for all teams, which is to say, this does not mean that one individual team is going to win or lose more than another, right? All this means is that the bargaining power of all teams to negotiate higher wages and to do all these sorts of things now decrease. Second thing we want to say is, oh, but people will still invest, right? There's still profit incentives to invest in this sort of thing. Shares raised or lower their prices, right? Meaning that even if you don't get a controlling stake, this will be like investing in a company. So there's still incentives to do this. But thirdly, they say this leads to a geographical lottery. The status quo is a much worse lottery, where if the big Saudi Arabian clubs don't like you, you cannot compete at all, right? Maybe there is a slight inequality between regions. It is far better than on what happens on their side of the house, where literally you need to sell out in order to access all these sorts of things, right? Where you don't get the big sponsors, you just simply cannot compete. Okay. then on to the meat and potatoes. Firstly, what are owners' incentives? Secondly, what are fans' incentives? Firstly, what are owners' incentives? Twofold incentives that they ignore, but we think are very bad. One, to appeal to as many people as possible, so to have a broad appeal as opposed to a deep appeal to individual fans. They do this in two ways. Firstly, for example, they trade like beloved players so they can have money for more marketable players internationally in some sort of ways and all these sorts of things, right? Because most like owners don't actually gain money from their core fan base. They gain money from exporting the culture of their club around the world as much as possible, right? But usually those people who engage with the club only a little bit have a far less big of an engagement than the fans that are like local, that are more engaged, that are likely to be engaged in this sort of thing. So the helping those people and focusing on them doesn't generate good fan utility. But the second way in which they do this is they often literally fuck over the past. They like rebrand in all these sorts of ways to appeal to more international ways. This is like the Sajid speech at the Nations League, right? They have incentive to do this in very harmful ways because they want to appeal to as many people as possible. But the second thing, and this is an incentive that's literally all identified, so this is like not even, we don't even need to do this. Success at all costs is bad. Wanting to succeed at all costs is bad. The reason is twofold. Firstly, you cut costs off of very useful things like community engagement programs or like having your players do certain things as opposed to doing other things and all these sorts of things because they come at the expense of winning and of paying people more. But the second thing is this raises costs for like seats and season tickets and all these sorts of things because they have an incentive to make those as expensive as possible because people will always buy them. Fans have incentives to lower them so they're available to the everyday fan who is now the majority. This is better because their ability to engage is greater. Secondly, what is incentive of fans? We want to say firstly something that I think, really like overdrew. Fans are not stupid. They're not that dumb, and they're not that dumb on two levels. Firstly, they can hire financial advisors that can tell you you are broke, you cannot sign Kylian Mbappe or you will go under. I think this is a relatively intuitive thing. You don't need to be big, strong businessman. But secondly, businessmen are fucking stupid as well. No, the difference, however, is one person making the decisions as opposed to many, many people making the big decisions in these sorts of ways. They never explain why one of them is in any capacity more capable than the other. Most times these owners are not football players. They're not football managers. They're just like oil company owners. So why are they in any capacity more capable? Before I go into all of the other reasons, I'll take off. And no, CEO.
But the nature of investment is going to be worse on your side of the house intuitively, because when you can only own a minority share in the company, all you're going to want to do is infer your reputation.
I have no idea what you said. I am so sorry. Irish accents, they go by me. Terribly sorry. Second reasons why fans have a very bad incentive. Note that second reason why fans have broadly good incentive. Fans have, how do you call it, a homogeneous incentive. And this is potentially rebutting what CEO wants to run. They will have big divides and this leads to very bad things. Often the things they value in a club applies to most, if not all of the core fan base. Things like the past, things like certain players that are widely beloved in all these sorts of ways. Meaning that keeping, these things often are separated between their incentives and the incentives of owners. At the point where these are separated and when I have this homogeneous incentive, there won't be a big divide. But the third thing is, and this we want to rebut from all, they don't have an incentive to only succeed at all costs. This is ludicrous. Again, they attach this to their own personal pride in all these sorts of ways. They don't want to be made fun of for being sellouts. They don't want to do immoral things because they don't need to justify the massive amount of money they spend, which private owners do need to do, right? So they can do things that are not absolutely necessary for success. Because note, even if a team doesn't succeed, you can take pride in them, that the players you like are playing well, right? Or they're developing in all these sorts of ways. You don't need to necessarily win now at all costs, and this is just asserted on their end. I don't understand why they want this. But then they finally say, identity can be accessed on both sides. What is the difference? The difference is a handful. One, and we said this is not like new things. Firstly, that often anti-player things are done, which angers fans. It makes them more disillusioned. When your favorite player is traded, it makes it so you can engage with this sort of thing substantially less. You can take pride in it substantially less. But secondly, it's often perceived as something distant, and your grassroots engagement in it is less. You don't come together with your friends to discuss strategies, what to do with this club, because you don't own the fucking club, right? In all these sorts of ways. Your ability to engage is predicated upon you feeling like you can make a difference to this engagement. Yes, vote me. No, vote us. Sorry.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for their fine speech, and I call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to conclude the case for the top half and side opening opposition.
Hi, can I be heard?
You can be heard.
Okay, great. I'll take POIs in the chat. If I'm not taking it by the 5th minute or so, feel free to unmute yourselves and POI me. Okay. I'll be starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I want to talk about two things in this speech. The first is I want to talk about the success of football clubs and who achieves that more and why that's important. And second, I want to talk about the counterfactual on our side of the house and why private owners are not the bastards that opening government make them up to be. Firstly, on the success of football clubs, a piece of framing here, panel. We argue that the sense of purpose, the sense of fulfillment, the sense of local pride that OG talks about is necessarily derived from the success of the clubs. And the reason for that is twofold. And this is where I deal with opening government, DPM telling us that even if you don't succeed, you can still have pride. You can't for two structural reasons. The first is when you are a fan of that club and the identity of the club is steeped into the identity of who you are as an individual. Every loss of the club is a personal loss to you. That is why every time Liverpool loses, it feels like fucking death for me. But the second reason is because success is necessarily relative and necessarily zero sum. That is to say, the nature of bragging rights means that if Liverpool loses to Manchester United, the Manchester United fans that CG makes themselves out to be can have bragging rights over me. And that means that there is a diminishment of my identity and a diminishment of my pride that I necessarily feel incredibly problematic about. That is the reason why success is important. And crucially, what this also means is that if you get success, you can get all the benefits that OG talks about in terms of local pride without necessarily owning the club. To that extent, why is it that we get better success on our side of the house? Temkin tells you that we get better success on our side of the house because the counterfactual they have to defend is one in which the success of football clubs becomes one of a geographic lottery. That is to say, we agree that fans have incentives for football clubs to succeed, but many of these fans don't have the ability to ensure that these football clubs can succeed. Temkin tells you that in geographically poor regions like the northwest of England, many of these fans, by virtue of them being geographically poor, are simply unable to do things like A, afford stadiums, afford to build stadiums, but B, afford like expensive international players, which means necessarily that the success of the clubs becomes increasingly compromised. And that's problematic. What do we hear from OG? OG says, OG says two things. The first thing OG says is, hey, Han, it's a comparative decrease for all teams, right? No, it's a comparative decrease for all teams in terms of private capital, but some congregations of fans are just by virtue of geography a lot richer. So London clubs like Arsenal and Chelsea perhaps will not be affected, right? Because maybe London fans are incredibly rich and they can fund random players like Aubameyang anyways. But the crucial delta is that for clubs like Liverpool, how are you going to buy Alisson? How are you going to buy Van Dijk without FSG funding you necessarily? So it's a comparative decrease for all teams in terms of private capital, but that's precisely Temkin's point, that's where the geographic moral lottery comes in. The second thing they say is, Han, it's a non-controlling stake. You can still have 40% of private capital. Yes, you can in theory, but why in practice would you do that? Why would a non-majority owner want to invest when they have no majority control and no autonomy over things like the buying and selling of players, like who to advertise to, like the negotiation of television contracts, for instance? So all of these reasons, just because you can have a non-controlling stake doesn't mean you will have a non-controlling stake. Then they say, Han, but the counterfactual is equally arbitrary, right? Because what if FSG doesn't want to buy you, right? What if the Glazers don't choose Manchester United? The crucial difference is this: on the comparative, we are still better. Why? Because even if you're a geographically poor region, private owners might still want to buy you because you have positive EX, right? Because you have positive potential. So for instance, right, even if Liverpool is incredibly poor and not successful, FSG still wanted to invest in Liverpool in the early 2010 because they saw Liverpool as a sleeping giant, because they saw Liverpool as a club in which there was a fervent fan base, because they saw the club as one in which you could potentially revamp it, and the potential profits are incredibly massive. That is a mechanism, and that is a counterfactual you never get on their side of the house. But the last argument here that Temkin tells you is that of the principal panel. Even if we take them at their very best, we think that even if you get any funding into the club in their best case scenario, that funding is morally unjustifiable because it comes at the expense of levying an unconscionable moral burden on these innocent fans. Because the narrative now is that if they don't finance the club and the club fails, that is completely on them. That is to say, the agency of ownership means that it begets moral responsibility for any failure. That is to say, these fans now self-internalize every single failure of the club exponentially financially, that's one. But the alternative is they end up doing irrational things like excessively pouring their savings into the club. So if your argument on OG is that, hey, Han, it's bad that fans are paying hundreds of thousands of if it's bad that fans are paying £100 per game just to watch the fans because they are morally manipulated to do so by these bastard owners, I tell you it's 10 times worse when they're morally manipulated to put their pension funds into the club, because they are telling you you can't buy Mohamed Salah if you don't put your pension funds into the club because we as a geographical region is dirt poor. I think that levies unconscionable moral burdens on these fans and makes them make irresponsible decisions. Before I move on to the counterfactual as to why private owners are actually okay, I'll take a point from closing government for engagement.
Okay, Burnley has not won the Premier League ever. How come they have any fans? Also, the #1 club in the world, Bayern Munich, is fan-owned. How are they able to buy world-class players?
Right, so we agree, like some fan-owned clubs can buy players because like Bayern Munich, for instance, I think like that region that they're in, maybe like they have like richer fans, so on and so forth. But what Hincapié tells you, and you have to answer the motion, is that why should this be the case for all clubs, especially if like there are certain clubs that by virtue of their geographic location are just simply unable to afford these players. That is the comparative. What then are the interests of private owners, and why do we think private owners are like not that bad? OG's main response to us is we don't have counter fiat. Look, we don't need counter fiat for two reasons. Firstly, financial fair play literally exists in status quo, and there is like incentives to like try and like increase the enforcement of financial fair play. Second, there is already like massive backlash and like lobbying efforts by the Premier League to try and void like the Saudi like sovereign wealth funds purchase of Newcastle. So these things are already happening in status quo. We think that for the most immoral of actors, like we clearly don't have to support those things. The crucial question is, why should we not allow like reasonable owners, like I don't know, the people that own Arsenal or Liverpool, for instance, to own these types of clubs? That's one. But the second response Hincapié tells you is that even if we agree that owners are profit maximizing, those incentives coincide with the incentives of the club. So if you want the club to be like profitable, you need the club to be successful, because that is the only way in which A, you can sell the club at a profit, and B, attract investments. But also you need to engage the fan base, because the fans are part of the commercial appeal of the club. So look at Newcastle. The reason Mike actually struggled to sell Newcastle for the longest time was because of the wanton fan boycotts, which means that like potential owners don't want to buy it because they don't think that there's like proper stadium revenue, because players don't want to go there because they are afraid of the fallout and backlash. The only response we hear from OG is but like you dilute the sort of like connection because now it's like internationalized. Two things. It's unclear why, like, just because you internationalize it, you dilute it. It's not a zero-sum game, guys. Knowing a Singaporean supports Liverpool doesn't mean that me as a Merseysider in Liverpool, like, reduces my support. If anything, knowing that more people support Singapore, Africa, everyone supports Liverpool makes me feel even better, because I know that my club is commercially and universally liked. For all these reasons, panel, walk on with hope in your hearts. We're incredibly proud to stand in opening opposition.
I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for their fine speech and everyone on the top path for the debate so far. I call upon the Member of Government to extend the government case and open up the back half. Yeah.
Sorry, for POIs, put them in the chat. Don't verbally interrupt, because I'm not going to be really looking at the chat that much. Sorry, I'm not going to be, the interrupting kind of throws me off my game. Do you have the flag?
Yeah, I do.
Well, are you just going to stand there the entire time?
Of course I am. Go.
Okay, I guess Abhijit will be standing behind me the entire time. Where's the timer?
Next to you.
Is it going to turn off?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. 3, 2, 1. Oh wait, no, sorry, fuck. My notes got deleted. Okay, yeah. 3, 2, 1. Very clearly how we're going to beat OG is that our case isn't going to rely on assumptions about how people identify themselves or how they achieve value in a very complex world with complex value systems. A few things in this case, but first I want to make one thing very, very clear in rebutting opposition, is that you still have a sufficient large number of investment to keep the game going and not like allow clubs to completely falter. Why is this the case? Because even if O shows there's a bit less money that exists in the sports, they never show why it is a tipping point to reasonably change the operations of clubs. Why will there still be a sufficiently large enough investment for the clubs to continue to sustain themselves, but also like the sport to continue surviving? One, there's a large football fan base that exists at the moment. So there's just a large consumer market in the status quo. Secondarily, it is a very stable consumer market. That is to say, people watch sports and have for the last 3 decades. Investors know that. They know they can make a return because there's always going to be consistent demand for the stuff they invest in. Thirdly, the returns on investment are possible even when you don't own the club itself. And this is incredibly important. LeBron has like a 30% share in Liverpool and doesn't actually have decision-making power, but he still invested because he could make money from that. That is to say, they never tell you why you need decision-making power in a club in order to get that sort of investment. Fourthly, there's increasingly low barriers of entry with more cheap streaming services, so the consumer base is largely to increase in the future. I think we still get a shit ton of investment in our world. Weighing then a little bit of weighing that I don't think opening did. Here's why you ought to care about the interests of local fans far more over anything else, because there are alternative avenues for people to get their entertainment that isn't sports. That is to say, OG is right in pointing out the outsized influence that sports has on fans' lives, the identity, the community network, etc. But they don't say why that should outweigh the sport becoming more competitive and entertaining for a larger number of people. The reason why you ought to care about this minority, even if it's like less of them than the larger sports consumer market or like people who watch sports, is because they have an alternative availability to get that utility. If they want to see something exciting, they can go watch Netflix instead of watching a competitive sports game. But these fans only have their clubs to support. So that's the way in which you break that deadlock. A bit of framing then. Identity arguments are not going to be that persuasive in this round for a few reasons. Insofar as it relies on an assumption of having epistemic access to people's values and preferences. Maybe it is correct that opposition is right, that most of them can only self-actualize when they win, right? Maybe people only get value in the club and their identity when they see it surviving. I don't know that. Our case doesn't make that assumption or rely on it, but how it increases the quality of life of fans and the local community as well. Not just the people that go to the stadium, but the local community at large. How then do we improve the local community? Here's the first part. Why can fans not have decision-making power in op world? And this is vital framing because it might be the case that opposition says that owners want to please the fans. Here's why they don't actually want to, or the interest doesn't align as much as they say. Local fans are deprioritized because one, they are numerically smaller insofar it is one city, but clubs have international fan bases. They're going to consider those interests over fans. But secondarily, international fans are likely to have more money because they have larger populations. So you can, across multiple countries, pick out the richest communities and fans and prioritize those interests. And thirdly, fans just have the least amount of capital that these owners care about because like sponsorship deals just pay billions of dollars and provide those deals. So that's why local fans cannot have decision-making power on side opposition. How then does it improve sports impacts on local communities? In a few ways. One, it takes into account local concerns that the club engages in. This looks like, for example, the environmental costs of building a stadium and the pollution that it might have, the local jobs. So when you build that stadium, you don't like ship cheap workers in, but you employ people within that community. The reason for this is that people in that community have decision-making power and take that consideration, whereas owners don't have to take that and are willing to kind of underskirt that if it's more cost effective. But secondarily and importantly, redistribution. It looks like paying the local staff more. It looks like not paying a player $100 million for kicking a ball, but building a local development like team and park for your local club to like keep like local like boys out of gangs, for example, and they can go play in that park. This is more likely to happen when the decision-making power is concentrated around the interests of that local community. These things are expensive and need to be considered, but rich owners care more about profit. Secondarily and importantly, you get far worse management. What do I mean by this? Private interests are and these owners are like private owners are far more short-termist than the comparative in our rules. Why? Because one, they want to see immediate profits to appease their shareholders, but secondarily, they largely care about a vanity project. So insofar as they don't see that they've won a title in 3 years, they feel like, fuck, like I'm not the coolest billionaire in the block now because my club didn't beat like Mohammed Usman's like PSG team that he bought, right? Like this is incredibly important important because the comparative is that local fans care about the long-term interests of the club insofar as they are forced to stick with it. Secondarily, you get more risky decisions on a moral hazard in club decision-making. Why it looks like taking on massive amounts of debt, for example. But why is this the case? One, this club is a tiny portion of these people's wealth. Failure doesn't matter to them as much because they literally have their other like oil shipping company that brings them the rest of their wealth. So they don't care if the club fails or not as much as like the fans do. Secondarily, they use the club as leverage and collateral for their other businesses. So they take on risky loans for their other ventures and say, I'm going to put this club, and if my business fails, then you take the club with you or like make the decisions for it. Thirdly, if they fail, they know the local community will scrape up and suffer to keep the club from defaulting as much as possible, which means that you create a moral hazard to create a lot of like risky and bad decisions that make clubs go under. Before getting into some more comparative work and impacting, quick.
Can you explain why the moral burden that you levy on poor fans to pour all their savings into the club is something that is morally permissible?
I don't know why they have to put like money, like I don't know why you can't still get investors who want to make a return on their profit, but they don't have to have decision-making power. Like people still invest in companies where they don't have 51% share of the company because they're going to make money. And see my analysis earlier on why you still get sufficient investment. The impacts of this moral hazard is that one, clubs are just more likely to fail, but secondarily, the entire local community gets fucked, even the non-fans. So it's the local food shops, the local shoe stores, people who go on that transportation. When the club fails, so does the city that relies on it for its demand and economic stimulus. And thirdly, they just don't care as much about club success as the fans, insofar as they can make a profit from increased marketing as opposed to like the club doing well and winning games. It is more likely that if the decision-making powers in the fans are going to take decisions, for example, to like sacrifice winning the league for 2 years, but developing their local youth program because it's going to make them win in 5 years when they develop the next gem. Finally, it just increases inequality in sports because the analysis that I give about rich owners leads to more inflation. So when you are able to spend $100 million to buy Mbappe and Neymar, that raises the cost on all of the other clubs that don't have a rich billionaire, which makes it inaccessible for these clubs to compete, which decreases competitiveness in the game, but also fits into O's framing that smaller clubs lose out more. Incredibly proud to propose this motion. You'll never walk alone.
I thank the member of government for his fine speech. I now call upon the member of opposition to continue the case for side opposition.
The first thing I'm going to do is a number of responses to closing government. Firstly, on the idea of funding, you get funding from like ticket sales, shirt sales, like television rights. That might be fine for like Bayern Munich, but it's not fine for Davenport United. Small clubs make up the majority of clubs, and they should be those that we care about in the context of this debate. Second thing to say is that private investment like LeBron in Liverpool is because he knows that the club is in safe hands because Liverpool isn't fan owned. The third thing to say is that the investors' international stuff is not as important for smaller clubs. So you don't have an international fan base for Burnley to the same extent. So you care. The logic of their analysis would they be that you pump the money into Burnley where you have that fan base. Fourth thing is that the sports washing material from OG disputes CG's claim, because if the sports washers want to get buy-in with the local fan base, they would invest in the local community. So there's no reason to believe why that's likely to happen. Again, we're going to dispute later why sports washing is more likely on your side of the house, but within your own bench, it's a knife. The fifth thing to say is that the local funding for clubs happen because of the local funding for clubs happen because it's a smart investment on our side, which is to say you have a large football fan base who are quite young and who will play for your club, who won't leave your club because they're the fan of that club, which is why you invest in those kinds of local academic programs when you're an investor that wants to see the club succeed in the long term. First thing to say is why are fans bad, right? I know that's material on this. I'm going to go a little bit deeper. The first thing is on short-termism. Opening opposition just say that they have pride in their club, but that doesn't deal with OG's material. And why can't your pride just infer that you should do better in the future? The realistic element is because the pride is because of history. You have pride in how the team succeeded beforehand, the cups you've won, the heroes, the legends that you have within that club. That means that if you are to say that the club is currently in a poor state or needs to be restructured or we're going to lose out on money and that kind of thing, it's an admission of weakness. This is why you get delusional Arsenal fans still thinking that the best team in the league. It's why Barcelona is racking up hundreds of billions of dollars in debt. It's not because they're buying flashy players. It's because they're structured financially in such a way that can't be changed without a lot of expertise and a mission of defeat. Second thing I'd say is socially. Most soccer fans are working class. Structural reason for this is time, as in it just spends less time to play a soccer match than a tennis match, which is the reason why you have that class disparity in soccer. Average footballer knows that anyway. Again, that is the reason why football fans are likely to be racist against minorities. Like, gut check this: Napoli fans, like the fucking like Athletic Bilbao fans against you've seen it yourself. The structural reason for that is that the basically like populistic narratives seeks to divide the working class amongst itself, such that the ruling class is able to maintain their power within society and the capacity and incentive to do so, which means they put identity groups against each other, which means you get things like Napoli fans being quite racist, which means that on the comparative, even if sports washing is likely, the kinds of social narratives that these clubs are likely to present is things like Napoli is for Italians and that kind of thing. They don't put up the pride flag. They don't put up BLM marches. They don't let the players kneel. That's the kind of thing that's more likely to happen in government side of the house. Third thing to say is on investments. Basically, investors just want control over their investments. I know opening opposition touched on this. We're going to provide the structural reasons for this now. Why are investors good? First thing to say is on the nature of investment. Basically, firstly, they're not publicly listed. The reason for this is that if they were publicly listed, that would allow for like hostile takeovers, random people like taking over a club, clubs moving and that kind of thing. The average informed voter knows this, but those are the structural reasons for it, because fans and the majority of people in the country are soccer fans, so they wouldn't want this to be the case. When you're setting up a football club from the initial instance, you wouldn't have that being the case, and that's the reason why that isn't true. Second thing to say is on purchases. Purchases have to be long-term agreements because they need to get the will from the fans, because that's the revenue source, as CG claim, for a lot of their money. If they don't get the will from the fans, they get things like fan boycotts and that kind of thing, which is the reasons why the purchase needs to take a long time, because you need to glide it over for that kind of thing. Third thing to say is the majority of money is generated from the sale. This is to say football clubs inherently aren't a profitable endeavor. It's only based off the market share that they have when they're winning competitions and that kind of thing, which means it needs to take a very long time for that money to accrue, which means you can't do things like hostile takeovers or spurious investments where you come in and like raise the money, or like raise the like value of the asset in the short term, but have a shit over the long term. Why that's important then is, whereas the reasons why, for some reasons why fans are likely to be short-termist, this is the structural reason why investors are likely to be long-termist, because they need to leave the club in a better state than they have it, because no one's going to buy your club when you say, when it's the case that, you don't have a strong academy set up, you're not doing proper scouting networks, your manager is really shit, like all those kinds of things, or your player base is aging, that kind of thing. The impacts of this are really important, because these are largely missing from top up. What are the impacts? Firstly, grassroots sports programs in local areas, which gives, health, fitness, and community to working class individuals. Secondly, scouting programs globally, which is to say, when you have more global scouting networks, because you're invested in the long term, right? You're willing to get these interests in the long term. You get things like players from the developing world coming over to your thing, earning a lot of money and saying that money back. This is why you get like Sadio Mane or like Mo Salah, like building hospitals and schools in their homeland, which flips the greenwashing point to a significant extent, because it improves the quality of life of people in the developing world. The next thing to say is get more stable clubs, because Davenport fails on your side of the house, and that's why you get a lack of community and that kind of thing happening. Final thing to say, I think this is really important, is why is sports washing actually more likely on their side? Because if an investor wants to seek a return on the investment by gaining money from the asset and selling it off, they're likely to be long-termist. But if they can't have enough control over their asset to do so, they're unlikely to invest in the first place. But even on their side of the house, if the club is majority fan-owned, as CG has said, they still have a lot of non-fan-owned business. The only people who then invest then, because they can't be certain on the return of their investment in terms of assets, will be people doing it for reputation and imaging. So the kinds of bad owners that you're talking about on your side of the house are more likely to invest in those kinds of areas. So you get things like greenwashing happening, because like Barcelona is fan owned, but they're still sponsored by like Qatar for a long time, right? That kind of thing happens more on their side of the house. Now, why do fans let this happen? I mean, firstly, the previous analysis means that they're going to be apathetic or accepting because they're not politically active in those sorts of ways, or the social ideas that they have aren't as liberal as debaters. The second thing to say is oftentimes these fans have no meaningful alternative, because you don't have a proper competition from other investors. So the only people offering you money to save your club are these specific people that are coming in within this period of time. And also, like, they promise things to locals, as opening government said. I'll take a point from opening.
Your analysis on short-termism both assumes that owners are perfectly rational always when making decisions, and that fans would not consult things like experts or managers, which we say handle day-to-day operations and stuff like this. Like, why is this true?
Because, so the reasoning for this is the people that the fans elect or choose or appoint to specific jobs are going to be given with a specific mandate that's been given to them by the majority of fans who are voting for these people in the first place. But your average Manchester United fan club person isn't into the expertise of these kinds of things, is probably not educated on like financial mismanagement and stuff like that, and probably doesn't have, because of analysis here, don't want to give up that admission of defeat, that admission of lack of pride, that admission of historical failure that would mean that they're more likely to be short-termists. But the structural reasons for why investors are long-termists apply then. How should you weight this debate then? Firstly, we've proven that clubs are more more likely to fail on our side of the house, which is an important impact. Secondly, we've proved why greenwashing or sports washing rather is more likely to happen on government side of the house, and the reasons why that were bad were already present within opening government. The third thing to say is the exogenous benefits that we bring towards things like investment within the developing world and in local communities is an important exogenous benefit in and of itself. We provide the structural reasons necessary for opening opposition's case to stand, and we've disputed the core claim from both government teams. As a consequence, we should oppose this motion.
I thank the member of opposition for their fine speech, and I call upon the government whip to conclude the government bench and the closing government case.
Hello, am I audible?
You are audible.
Well, fantastic. Right. Let me see. I will not be looking at the chat, but I will probably ask OO for a POI about 5 minutes. So please have one. Ready? Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I just want to start off with CO with their weird racism point. Number one, I don't think we have epistemic access to go, oh yeah, the majority of fans of a club are going to be racist. I think that's weird bullshit. Number two, even if that was true, you have the same probability of, yeah, fucking Saudi Arabian prince might be racist, right? Sure, if the owner is racist and therefore the club, everything becomes fucking racist, it's equally probable that one owner can also be racist. I don't understand why that's unlikely to be true. Secondly, I think most fan-led reviews on racism and LGBT rights tend to be coming from fans and not owners in the first place. So I'm unsure why there's a specific delta on that. Okay, then on improving the quality of clubs and on sports washing in this regard. Okay, I think this is what nobody is understanding in this debate. How do football clubs make money? How do they make profit? What does investment do? Liverpool gets about £800 million in revenue every year from TV deals, from selling shirts, from selling tickets, merchandising, etc. Right? Over the last 5 years, that means Liverpool has made a total revenue of £4 billion. Right? The total investment that FSG has put in Liverpool in the last 5 years is £150 million. This means that investment, quotation mark, unquotation mark, from owners into clubs is a fucking marginal delta in whether or not clubs dramatically increase the total amount of fucking money they have in the first place. So I just think that this mitigates out a lot of what fucking opposition says about investment forming the delta, right? Even if that wasn't the case, I think at the point at which investors are still likely to want to improve the clubs to a certain extent by, investing in future profitable clubs, or at the point at which that they probably want to take some of the money out, as in investors, in order to be able to pay themselves a fucking salary, have to be able to take money out of the total profits and revenue that the club makes in order to turn profit. That's how businesses work, right? So it means that the total amount of revenue the club makes is actually not all going back into the club as they probably would in a fan-owned club, but rather going significant to a significant degree in the fucking owners' pockets, which is why rich owners hoard the wealth when they get majority decision-making power comparative to the on the comparative. This means that there is less investment in the actual football at the point at which that you give it to investors comparative to whether or not fans own it in the first place, right? Secondly, bro, you can still get shirt sponsors and shit like that, right? Big corporations are still going to fucking sponsor the fucking Liverpool shirt or the Burnley shirt or whatever, regardless of whether or not they own the fucking club at the same time, right? Ahmed tells you about redistribution and addresses this anyway. The second thing is on short-termism and pride in history. Well, this is all quasi nonsense, right? They say, oh yeah, these these people aren't going to know how to manage these clubs in the first place. Number one, these people have grown up for 40 years to dedicate themselves to knowing ins and outs how to about football and management, etc. I'm unsure why that they don't know. Secondly, at the point at which that these other or foreign businesses, as Ahmed already characterizes, just don't fucking know anything about football in the first place. I'm unsure why they make better owners or make better decision-making powers or more likely to consult financial experts than the fans who want to see their club survive, right? I'm unsure why the fans don't want to see their club survive. Thirdly, I think this just underestimates that some fans just are prudent, and at the point at which that you have lots of fans that are making decisions, you're likely to have a comparative lots of different interests are being balanced out. This also applies to the smaller clubs that CO prioritizes in the first place, right? So at the point at which that like the small, and I think this is important because at the point at which that according to CO, they say, smaller clubs are going to get this random investment because they might have a potential future growth. I'm unsure whether or not they will get sufficient investment to make them a big difference, but at the point at which that most of them tend to be like these huge vanity projects for like private billionaires in order to do their own thing, I'm unsure why they're going to like specifically invest in some smaller clubs. Secondly, upon the metric of like, according to OO, that fans only support clubs because of their fucking success in the first place, then at the point at which, or like people are only happy if like football fans are successful, then at the point at which that some billionaires end up financing some clubs and only they win, then every single other club in the league is comparatively going to lose and all their fans are going to become unhappy, which means that you actually cause a net disutility on their side comparative to our side, right? So even at the point at which that like, if that was a metric you're going to prove, you're going to prove that somebody else has to lose in your metric, which means that like your total net utility does not increase. On our comparative, net utility always increases because the money goes into local communities. And at the point at which that we can't access the epistemic preferences of whether or not these people give a shit about whether or not like they care about winning in the first place, but they probably do care about whether or not you have more football pitches, whether or not there's community investment, whether or not schools have more free meals, whether or not Liverpool finances fucking free bus passes for all people in like Liverpool city centre. I think those are all things that have like guaranteed epistemic benefit, whereas I have no idea of whether or not I'm likely to be able to access whether or not the success is likely to be true. Secondly, I think at the point at which the luck like exists and like goals could go in or goals could not go in, like regardless of like whether or not like you finance like in millions and millions or not, and like random talents can just pop up and just be good at football in the first place. I'm unsure why like necessarily like always investment is going to lead to great outcomes, right? So for example, I don't know, like Arsenal have like a very rich club but are doing much shitter than fucking West Ham, who have a lot less money and a lot less comparative investment just because they're better, right? So then, moving on to just LO quickly, and then I'm going to weigh against OG. So I think LO, I think they have a weird metric that success is exclusive at the point of investment, but they don't prove why investment forms a tipping point about why these clubs are going to be more successful, and we mitigate most of this other out. Anyway, at the point at which that we like have guaranteed benefits comparative to whether or not they have guaranteed benefits, and even if their guaranteed benefits like exist, then on their own metric they're going to cause harm to everybody else. I don't think that they can win. Okay, before I carry on, do you have a POI?
It's insufficient to just rely on TV deals and shirt deals because they are equally high costs of the day-to-day running, the funding of stadiums, the paying of players enormous salaries, and the setting up of local academies. That is why private capital and injection of capital is important.
Yeah, but you pay people like comparatively less salaries in the first place at the point at which fans own it. Also, because like everybody's like money like comparatively goes down outside, it becomes equally like competitive, which means I'm not sure. Secondly, like people are still going to fucking put in money and invest in the club even if they don't have decision-making capability because they want the investment to grow. And you have not proved why that's not likely to be true. Okay, finally, to weigh against OG. OG impacts are limited to just the fans of these clubs. Ahmad's impacts extend to the local economy and community more than just the fans. This is a wider base and it also has guaranteed effects given the fact that we don't know whether or not necessarily fans are going to be happy or unhappy given the plurality of opinions and that we don't know what benefits they create. OG doesn't explain why private owners are structurally more likely to make worse or risky decisions. Ahmed shows you why there is a moral hazard that exists with the rich owners and not as much with fans. Ahmed's three mechanisms. Thirdly, OG doesn't explain where rich owners' interests are opposed to local fans, as in the local benefits and redistributions are definitively more costly, which is why rich owners deprioritize them. Lastly, I think at the point at which that we prove that like the way that fans like clubs make money in the first place doesn't necessarily come from investments, and even at the point at which it comes from investments, those investments can likely be attained on both sides. And secondly, at the point at which that you have more fan buy-in, I think that means that you probably have a greater marketing capability, which means that you get more buy-in. We explain why less investment, even if we get less investment, it's fine as long as fans get like better like stuff and like the community locally improves. And these are guaranteed benefits and they get bigger share. For all these reasons, we beg you to propose.
I thank the government whip for his fine speech, and I call upon the opposition whip to conclude the case of closing opposition, the op bench, and the debate as a whole.
Very effective, I was going to say. Right, so I'm going to order the timer up. The cables have fallen. So is a piece of paper, but it's a blank one. Panel. Oh, sorry, one second. It's summertime. Take another drink of water. Setting 3. Panel, I think if the GovWhip was judging this debate, they would realize the way that our case interacts with it and would have spent a lot more time on us because, frankly, Dylan's won this debate. I'm going to show this by discussing three things: the amount of investment and the way that investment functions, then talking about club functioning more generally, and thirdly, discussing moral costs and winning there, even independently of the other two classes, which we just win anyway. So note the way that the sort of debate separate to CEO works is the idea that you have short-termist and profit. This is the Gov line the whole way through. If CG were judging, they'd also realize that kind of derivative at times, but that's by the by. The crucial thing here is the idea that people, like private owners, want money. They want returns on their investment. They want, but they're inherently short-termist when they do this. The claim back is that if you have no control over something, you're not going to invest in it. The problem is, and I think it's fair for especially DPM to point this out, that like if shares go up and down and you can make money, if you can get money out of something, you will do it. The problem is, so like, it's essentially true that control probably doesn't matter if you're investing in Microsoft. I'm not like, oh, I can't tell Bill Gates what to do, so I'm not going to invest in Microsoft. The issue is that when you invest in Microsoft, it's publicly listed. So whenever you perceive there to be a bad decision, whenever you perceive that that the asset's going to stop making money, that it's going to go down in value and you'll be making a loss if you sell it beforehand because you're able to get out quickly because it's publicly listed. Dylan's crucial analysis is the idea that football clubs function fundamentally differently. They're not standard investments. They are long-term. They are significant assets which you must try to be able to have control of. So if it is the case that you can only make money out of investment through a football club by upping the value of the asset, by making sure that it's more sustainable so someone else buys it in. First of all, that looks like things making sure you have a good academy which produces its own players so you don't have to buy as many through transfers and you can sell on people making money for the club. It also just make sure you have a solid consumer base, making sure you have solid marketing, making sure you're running the club well so that's sustainable and it's an attractive asset for someone else to purchase. Because the fact is that you can't make money off of it of the way. It's private, so you don't have like shareholder equities like you do in a lot of public things, because you're the shareholders who are trying to like just make money off this in the future and that would go away from being able to compete. But that's the crucial thing, because it's competing. There's no profit because you're competing against 20 other teams in the league to try and make the amount of money on based on where you finish. Try to get that fan base by coming first or coming into the Champions League, and having more eyes going on to you and making your club a more and more attractive, sustainable product by expanding your consumer base in the future. The problem with this is that because success is uncertain, because it's all rooted in sport, which is massively uncertain, that anything can happen in 90 minutes, you then have to pivot as much money as possible into investment into the future. I mean, you aren't able to make profits in the short term. What this crucially means is you're not making profits in and of itself just by owning a club. It's the fact that you will eventually sell it, the fact that you're raising the assets. So what this means is twofold. First of all, this flips the functioning of clubs because it's significantly about the way that shifting incentives such that no matter what, private-owned clubs make sure that they are best ran for the sustainability and proper functioning of a club and being able to build a proper dynasty with the club, making sure the clubs are safe, making sure they never fail. But secondly, now this just tips the amount of investment, because when OO and thus activates OO, because they're so important for the idea that we need investment into football, but you don't get this because there's no control. But when control doesn't matter because it's short-termist, that point doesn't work. We activate this point by showing control actually does matter because it's not short-termist, it's long-termist, thus co-opting their impacts there. The responses we hear in CG are the idea like you have loads of revenue. Note Dylan pointed out this may be true for Bayern Munich, but it's fucking not for Davenport United. Please don't ignore the mass amount of clubs that exist out there. And note, like, these clubs have private owners too. Like Wrexham AFC, which is in fucking League One, is owned by like fucking Ryan Reynolds, because these are things which assets you can continually build in value equally. And you want to buy these cheap ones because they're already at such a low level that if you get them into even the Championship or into the Premier League, then they'll be worth loads as assets. But moreover, the idea that you can just take money out of your club, this is your own member of government said that you don't care about taking money out of the club in the short term because you have other revenue streams. And the analysis for the fact of reasons why you can't and why that'll hurt your asset because you're not able to compete is why that never happens. On club functioning then, note that the idea that the Gov bench rely on that local fans are fucked, just two responses to this. First of all, Dylan pointed this out, not everyone has a fuck ton of international fans. Burnley does not have fucking international fans, at least not more than 10 of them, because that's just fucking true. Secondly, no, even if you have a bunch of international fans, the optics of being an owner who listens to your fans is massively important, right? Because even though I'm in Dublin, if I as the Chelsea fan saw that Chelsea went into the Premier League went into the Super League despite mass protests outside, I would feel like the owner doesn't give a shit about fans. And because you want to feel as part of a community, even if you're internationally away from it, you want to associate with local fans. You want to feel like you are part of that, sort of a unity of having something where you all care about equally. You want to have a source of meaning equally from it. So if UC fans aren't being listened to, you too will also participate in boycotts. You too will also hurt the bottom line. But also just like you need local fans who live there to go to fucking games. People can't get flights every fucking week. Jesus Christ. I know it's football, but be realistic. Come on. Secondly, then, what is the idea that like fans are smart versus like the short-term success base that OL give? I think that these can align if you're judging this, because OL's claim on the idea that like your short-termist can sort of align with pride and with fans being smart. I think these aren't really attention, so OL's thing doesn't work, because you can know that realistically we're not going to win straight away. Well, like you can know like, oh, I'm not going to go crazy. We're not going to be crazy. Things like buying players who are unrealistic for you to be able to afford and things like that aren't things which are going to happen because fans are relatively smart. But they will still want success relatively soon, maybe. But I don't think that's what's going to damage clubs, because it's not the purchase of Coutinho, which is why Barcelona are in billions of debt, but Coutinho only costs like 100 million. It's the fact that they didn't upgrade La Masia. It's the fact that they didn't expand their commercial base because they simply thought they were so great. It's the way that the crucial mechanism is the unwillingness to admit any weakness whatsoever. The unwillingness to ever say, we need to update things. I'll take a POI from OG.
Isn't it better in the long term to have discourse between fans who have specific knowledge and experience within the club with financial experts? Like,
do you really think financial experts and CEOs wouldn't get in like former players or sporting directors who know how fucking football works if they think they don't? That's a crucial response. What's crucial separately as well is that it's the admission of guilt, because even if you buy OO, the idea is that they would maybe prove that clubs will function slightly better over the next few years. But our thing about the admission of guilt is more impactful, because it's about whether or not clubs fail. It's about revenue. It's about rebuilding your stadium to make sure it's able to house people into the future. It's not house people, be able to house fans into the future. Separately, though, on moral costs, because I think what's crucial here is that even if it's the case that like both consult experts, as like sort of gave in response to the POI, even if both things are relatively well-rounded because people want to make money and fans aren't stupid and that kind of things, I'm not really sure where this debate lands. I'm not sure who is going to have massively better run clubs. What I do know is there's more sports washing. I do know that the likes of Rima Akhmetov get to go over and gloss over their reputation. He's just the owner of Shakhtar Donetsk. Sure, he supports separatists in Donetsk and uses Shakhtar Donetsk trucks to give aid to make it seem like he doesn't, and because of that avoids critique. But that's what hurts real people on the ground. And the football clubs are going to be fine either way.
I thank the opposition whip for their fine speech. I think everyone thought it was genuinely a high-quality debate. Congratulations to all of you for breaking again. This is an amazing achievement, and you'll find out the results later. So please leave so we can deliberate. Thank you.
Sorry. One thing is, make sure to go back to Zoom A, because that's where we're going to be releasing the results. And yeah, cool.
Thanks, Annika.
Thanks.